talk to you about this little thing I've been working on with regards to my new book. So I'm writing a new book called The Trouble with Trauma. I'm doing a lot of writing in my head, not a whole lot of typing going on. Getting there. But I think what's interesting is that I've been formulating and working through the premise of the book, which ultimately is around what is trauma and why is trauma such a big problem for us. So in essence, I'm going to just put it out there and say our primary emotional need as human beings is for connection. Me to you, you to everybody around you, even me with the dog, okay? Connection. We all need it as human beings. In fact, it's absolutely essential to our survival. So the basis of trauma is, in essence, a disconnection. So why do we have traumatic events in our lives? It's because we have a disconnect. So my big explanation at the moment about why all of this stuff kind of comes together and why trauma is so important to understand is because our very first experience of a trauma that we actually recall and remember, and we can kind of that we actually make an attribution for, so we blame ourselves for, is usually when you're about 4 years old. So your first experience is actually an abandonment. Now people sort of say to me, how do you know that it's at 4? So really interesting. From when you're born to when you're 2 or thereabouts, your primary emotional needs are met by your primary caregiver. So your mum or, whoever looked after you as a baby. Your needs are met. Your needs are always met. You're fed, you're clothed, you've got a roof over your head, okay? You're kept warm. At about 2, around that sort of 18-month mark, when the kids start to say no, they're starting to learn about language and what's important, and they notice the reaction that they get when they say no. But around 2, we get desire. So what's the big deal about desire? So the importance of desire is that I'm throwing a tantrum, right? And it's because instead of just having a need for food, I've suddenly now got a desire for something else. But I don't have language, so I can't communicate that desire to you. In my brain, I think that my primary caregiver knows exactly what I'm thinking, because everything up until then, right? The mother knows what the child needs. So at this point, when need changes to desire, I'm looking to my parent to give me what I want, and I don't necessarily get it. Now, there's a range of reasons why I don't get it, but why do I throw tantrums? Because I don't have language to communicate what I desire, and I'm usually not getting what it is that I want. So from there, we kind of get on with it, and we get more language and we get more awareness, but we still think that our parent can understand what's going on in our head. In fact, we think that all of the adults around us can read our minds. And what I really love is that moment when we know that we get individuation fully. So they'll usually be able to look in a mirror and kind of go, say their name, like, maybe at 1 or 2, it's kind of like they can point in the mirror and go, Kerry, right? They know that's the name that they give that baby or that person that they see in the mirror. But there's an argument that says they don't actually realise that that's them, that they are an individual, because they still see themselves as an extension of the parent until they're 4. What happens at 4? At 4, they work out that they can know things, that little voice inside their head knows things that their parent doesn't know. And when they've reached that point of true individuation, because they'll say, I've got a secret. And that's that point when you recognize that actually they know that they are an individual, that what they think inside their head, their parent cannot know unless they express it. And what's funny is soon after that, they learn to tell lies. So why is that important? Because from that point, you understand that the things that happen to you happen because you impact them. So what do we know about children? Up until about the age of 10 or 12, they have concrete thinking. Good things happen to you because you're good, and bad things because you're bad. Simple as that. Black and white. Okay? So at 4, you may be aware of when it happened to you, at 4, you'll have a moment after you recognize that you were an individual where you felt an abandonment or a disconnection from your primary caregivers. and you reasoned to yourself at that point in time that it was your fault. Okay, why is that important? Because this is the child part that you then later on will tap back into when you're feeling rejected. Now, I'll explain that later, and I can tell you now, I'm going to have to make this at least 2 or 3 videos, I think. So, let me pause here just in case we need to do that. So, moving on from that awareness that at 4 is your first experience of an abandonment, you then spend your time trying to ensure that you don't have that experience again. So you're trying to avoid the rejection. And so what do we know about children in terms of, when we have that sense of abandonment, the emotional response is shame. Okay, so then we decide we don't like how that feels and we don't want to be rejected in the future, so we start to become anxious because it's fear-based, right? So primary school children experience anxiety. Now, I got really enthused, I think I said to you about the movie a few videos ago. I talked about the movie Resilience that came out that was actually research-based about the fact that if we have a number of adverse childhood experiences, and in particular if you have more than 4 out of 10 within your early childhood, then you are more than twice as likely to develop a chronic disease and more likely to lose about 20 years off your life expectancy. Now, why is that? So a bunch of researchers in the US actually found that it was because there were these high levels of adverse childhood experiences. Now, my case, I'm saying high levels of trauma, okay? So same, they spend the rest of their time though in their early primary school years trying to control their environment because they're a little bit fearful about what might happen and they can become quite anxious. Now, anxiety in a child in primary school can be managed reasonably well depending upon what the family situation is like. Because at that age, or up until about the age of 12, children look to their family connections to give them that sense of security and support. So if they've got a good, solid family base, right, even if they've experienced an abandonment, and just a little secret, every single one of you out there, because I'm telling you, every single person in the planet actually has this experience around that point in time from something that happens between them and their primary caregivers. For some people it's a huge thing, for other people it's only a little thing, okay? But it's enough to make that child fearful of a future abandonment. Now, if the rest of the family situation is reasonably secure, as in mum and dad, the household's not volatile and it's all pretty stable, then that works out not too bad, right? So from there, the child can kind of get through life without being too terribly anxious during primary school. But if that home life is really unstable, then that kid's lining themselves up for some problems, okay? And I think as a society, we really need to understand that if we wait to intervene until a child is in their adolescence, we've left it too late. We actually need to intervene in primary school and start addressing their high levels of fear, because their anxiety is usually triggered by something, but they don't even know what it is, right? They're not able to communicate it. But for all of you out there going through divorce, what I need you to understand is if you've got children in your household, even though it looks like they're okay, you need to spend time communicating with them about why it's important that they understand that it's not their fault, that the relationship broke down, that, mummy and daddy still love them just as much as they did before. They just don't want to live in the same house together anymore. Really, really important that those kids understand it's not their fault. All right? I can't stress how important that is. So, move on into adolescence. And I should take a breather here just in case I decide I've been waffling too long and I need to give you a little bit of a break. In comes adolescence. Right, what's the key about adolescence that's really important? In adolescence, your job is to separate yourself from your parents, okay? So your parents, at that point, you think your parents are the most deadbeat people on the planet and you really don't want to be anything like them. They embarrass you or whatever it is, okay? But in your adolescence, your job is to differentiate yourself from your parents and actually try and link yourself very strongly to your peers. Why do adolescents experience depression? And I've done research around this, right? It's around 40% of adolescents experience depression at some point. And, we talk about what comes first, depression or anxiety, there's an argument that says chicken or egg, who knows? But I'm actually going to put my hand on my heart and say, I'm telling you it's anxiety. Shame first, but shame actually leads you to a point where you start to go, I don't want to experience shame again, so I get anxious to avoid it. So I'm fearful of experiencing that shame again, so I do everything I can to avoid it. But when we hit adolescence, we often get to that point where we're trying to differentiate ourselves from our parents and connect with our peers. If our connection to our parents is secure and we don't get a very good connection to our peers, then it's usually not too bad. We'll manage adolescence okay. Won't be perfect, but it'll be okay. If you've had a really revolting parental relationship and your home life is very unstable, sometimes you can get really good connection to peers, usually because you'd be there with all the other kids that have got big problems, right? Because their home life is rubbish, but they end up kind of grouping together and rebonding into a family, if that makes sense. They'll usually survive adolescence without getting depressed either. It's kind of interesting. They'll often be the juvenile delinquents, but they actually manage without getting depressed about it as such until they hit the drugs, and that's a whole different ballgame. So, but then, move on past that. Why is it that some kids will end up with depression? Because the family life's not given them the stability that they need, and they have not been able to get that good peer-to-peer social connection as well. So then they kind of go, I don't fit with the family, I don't fit with my peers or in the community, I'm really disconnected now, so then I become depressed. Okay, so adolescence is full of things like I'm different, I don't belong, right? All of those things. So why is that really important? Because remember I talk about in the life cycles, we get to the point where we get to the end of our third development cycle and we go, I'm just going to be this thing. And when I'm this thing, then everybody will think I'm awesome. So you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps coming out of that, mediocre adolescence, coming off the back of a reasonably disconnected family life in your primary years, and you just decide, I'm just going to prove myself by being this, thing, whatever, insert big whoopee word here, or your feelings of wanting, being rejected by your family, and if you're not able to connect with your peers, you'll often line up on one side or the other. I want to really please my family, so then I'll go on and I'll be whatever it is the family want me to be, right? And I need to be this perfect human being. And just be aware, you'll all slot yourself into different parts along this continuum, right? Because it's not a whole segmented, but this is a continuum of how we look at life. So why is it important? Because when we get into depressed space, depression is very much shame-based, okay? Anxiety, very much fear-based. Depression is looking back going, oh, if only this didn't happen, if only that didn't happen. Anxiety is looking to the future going, what if this happens, what if that happens, okay? Very clear distinctions about what the difference between depression and anxiety actually is. All right, so why is that important? Because in all of our future connections that we make, friendships, intimate relationships, family connections, our ability to get secure connections with other people has an awful lot to do with how we were raised. So if you were raised in a family in which your connection to your parents was what I would call enmeshed, so you have, and this happens in a lot of cultures, like European cultures and stuff, where the expectations placed on children by their parents are huge. Their obligations to their parents in terms of making sure they get a really good outcome, their education, the parents have invested all this time and energy into them and the child owes them. Does that make sense? So that emotional responsibility, the child actually has almost to give to the parent what the parent wants. Now, that's problematic for a range of other reasons, but it happens, right? Or there's lots of other emotionality stuff going on where sometimes, highly critical mothers or fathers or whatever, but they make their child emotionally responsible for them. On the other side, we've got complete neglect. And, at a really extreme end, it's really severe neglect, but it can just be, I'm a member of a really big family and mum and dad were working or busy or whatever, and your presence in the household was just kind of like, oh yeah, well, if you were around, great. If you weren't, didn't really matter that much. It was not like your presence or involvement in your parents' life was really that important. And for some people, it's a total rejection, right? Their parents actually wish they weren't there. But all of us fit in that continuum somewhere. And I'm going to give it to you, it's a bit like a bell curve, okay? So you've got the really enmeshed ones at one end and the really neglected ones down the other. And the 80% of us sit somewhere in between. Why is that bell curve important? Because whenever you go into a relationship, and it doesn't matter, like I said, intimate relationship, friendship, working relationship, family connections, how you react or respond to any potential rejection within that relationship is going to be determined by your parental relationships and then how many times you feel rejected. So if you've gone through your adolescence and you've been able to have good peer connections, then your tendency to be more extreme is probably going to be a bit less. But if you've gone through your adolescence and not been able to get good connections, so in other words, you've usually come out of it depressed because you didn't have good family connections either, you're going to have more experiences of rejection, more of a sense that you're really not valuable or worth it. Okay, why is that important? Because it sets us up for how we behave whenever we perceive a rejection's going to happen between us and another human being. So whenever we perceive a disconnection, right? So let me take you back to that trauma word. So whenever we experience a trauma because there's a disconnection that's happened, even when we perceive a disconnection, we're going to react in one of two ways, all right? And then we're going to flip. If you grew up in a household where you were enmeshed, your first port of call is actually going to be quite clingy. And you're going to please don't leave me. Please connect with me. Is there anything I can do? I'm sorry. I don't know what I've done, but just please let me. I'll do whatever you want to work it out, right? On the total other side is a sense of absolute protector rejection. It's kind of like, all right, you don't want to hang out with me? Fine, back off. It's crickets, right? Ghosted. All of a sudden, I've disappeared. Okay, why is there distinction between the two, right? And then